It's the Real News Network, and I'm Greg Wilpert coming to you from Baltimore. Countries of Africa continue to struggle with their economic development and tend to remain towards the bottom in world rankings of GDP per capita. A recent study conducted by the Political Economy Research Institute, PERI, sheds new light on why countries in Africa have a hard time developing. The study is titled Magnitude and Mechanisms of Capital Flight from Angola, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa, and it develops a new methodology for estimating the extent of capital flight from these countries. The study was authored by Léonce Ndikumana and James Boyce. We have spoken to Léonce Ndikumana before about capital flight from Africa in general terms. This new study, however, zooms in on these three countries, Angola, Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa. It finds that during the 40-year period from 1975 to 2015, $60 billion were lost from Angola, $32 billion from Côte d'Ivoire, and $198 billion from South Africa to capital flight. The main means for this capital flight appear to have been a combination of misinvoicing, underreporting of exports, overreporting of imports, and cheating on taxes and tariffs. We are now joined by Léonce Ndikumana to discuss this study. Léonce is Professor of Economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and he's also Director of the African Development Policy Program at the Political Economy Research Institute. Also, he's the co-author of the book Capital Flight from Africa, Causes, Effects, and Policy Issues. Thanks, Léonce, for joining us again.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you.
So before we delve into the specifics, tell us why it is important to understand the magnitude of capital flight. What does this figure tell us about a country?
Thank you very much for the opportunity again to talk about this important subject as to why it's important to we worry about the magnitude of capital flight from African countries. The simple answer is that we are concerned and interested about the way African countries can finance their development programs. As you indicated in your introduction, African countries have made big strides in terms of accelerating growth and even reducing poverty, but we know that the continent continues to trail other continents in terms of levels of poverty which remain very high inequality, massive gaps in financing for infrastructure, for basic services like education and health, and therefore for these countries, every penny counts. So the reason why I'm interested in capital flight is because it basically undermines the efforts of those countries to mobilize resources to meet those urgent needs. Every penny that leaves the country, that's smuggled out of the country, is money that could have been used to build schools, roads, and clinics, and keep kids in school and accelerate growth. That's why we are interested in this phenomenon. And when we look at the numbers, as you said, these are large numbers that amount to money that have been leaving the country unaccounted for, but it belongs to private individuals who are able to smuggle the money out of the country, who are able to accumulate the wealth abroad without being taxed, typically in secrecy jurisdictions in all kinds of forms, financial, liquid assets or physical assets. So the reason why we are interested in capital flight and its magnitude is because it's a constraint to financing development. And again, another reason why we wanted to do this particular study on focusing on three countries, which we hope to continue and do other countries, is because so far we have been looking at the magnitudes of capital flight from the continent, looking at many countries, and we have seen that it is a problem. But we realize that we actually have been so far we have been looking at the forest, and we haven't looked at the trees.
So when looking at your data on Côte d'Ivoire, it seems that this country was able to stop capital flight and even reverse it around the year 2000. But you also argue that this is not necessarily the result of better policy, but maybe because there was a misinvoicing of exports, which is being balanced out by misinvoicing of imports. Is this the case? And what does that kind of misinvoicing mean for the lives of the people of Côte d'Ivoire?
Yes, thank you. The case of the interesting thing about when you start looking at individual countries in more details, you find that different countries have different pictures emerge from different countries. In the case of Ivory Coast, as you indicated, the last 10, 15 years look very different from the previous years. And what is the biggest source of change is trade misinvoicing. In the case of Ivory Coast, what reduces what we call the measured capital flight is this peculiar situation where you have exports for which the value recorded by Ivory Coast seem to be very different from the value recorded by its trading partners. And it's peculiar in the sense that normally when it comes to exports, export misinvoicing normally amounts to exporters declaring a lower value than the importers, the buyers, as a way of keeping money abroad. But in some cases, as in the case of Ivory Coast, you have this very strange situation where the importers are declaring much larger amounts than the exporting country, which doesn't make sense. And that's why at this, when you look only at the aggregate, it's difficult to explain what is happening. And that's why in this study, we want to go to the disaggregate level and look at how the major products of Ivory Coast are being traded and recorded between Ivory Coast and its trading partners. Because what could be happening is that cocoa is the biggest, is probably the biggest commodity export from Ivory Coast. So we want to look at how is cocoa export being recorded in Ivory Coast and among its trading partners. If you found, in a case, for example, where you would find that the importing partner is recording a larger number than Ivory Coast, the one possibility would be that the Ivory Coast, the Ivorian cocoa, is being shipped from other places than Ivory Coast, so the neighboring countries. And you wonder, how did it get there? So you want to look at, are there any smuggling between Ivory Coast and its neighboring countries? Are the shipments correctly recorded in terms of the destination where they're heading? One of the problems we have encountered in trying to reconcile trade statistics is the role of what is called trading hubs. These are, for example, in Switzerland and Netherlands. These are places where you have major trading companies, but these areas function like no man's land where goods don't get recorded as being imported, even though the company recorded them as being bought by that company that resides there. And it's difficult, then it becomes difficult to reconcile the origin and the destination of the product, which is a big problem, because if for Ivory Coast to be able to know that they are getting the fair value of their exports, we need to know the price of the cocoa at the origin and the price of the cocoa at the destination. When there are black holes in the trading chain, that's a big problem. And that's what we tend to find in our analysis. So our country detailed analysis will try to go into more detail and look at not just the aggregate trade statistics, but the trade statistics by sector, by commodity, by trading partner, to try to reconcile the values of trade on all sides of the transactions.
Now, looking at Angola, the story seems to be the opposite. Angola emerged from civil war and Portuguese colonization in 1975 and was ruled by a socialist government supported by Cuban troops until 1990, and then quickly plunged into a second civil war between 1992 and 2002. Now, your data shows that despite the bloody history of Angola prior to 2002, things have begun getting worse in terms of capital flight rather than better after the ceasefire of 2002. What is the government doing wrong?
That's a very interesting question. I don't know if it is only the government of Angola that's doing something wrong, because one of the points we make in our analysis of capital flight is not the sole responsibility of African governments, African economies generally, or African actors, because capital flight and the channeling of capital from African countries disguised from authorities heading to foreign destinations is made possible only because in those foreign destinations, there are willing partners who are willing to disguise the assets that are channeled in those markets by private Africans away from the eyes of the authorities. This includes banks in offshore financial centers, all the kinds of intermediaries that facilitate the transfer and concealment of those assets, including lawyers, accounting firms, and so on. So I make this point because it's easy for the public to blame African governments only when it comes to capital flight, illicit financial flows. But I keep saying that if the problem was only on Africa, then that money that's being shipped out of the continent in disguised form will not find a home. The bankers will not accept it. The foreign countries will not accept it. But the reason why this phenomenon continues is because we are dealing with a very opaque international financial system where it is easy to disguise the ownership of assets because of willing collaborators, enablers as banks, accounting firms, accountants, legal lawyers who facilitated the manipulation of financial ownership of assets and so on. In the case of Angola, we find that it's a typical case of a resource-rich country that has been able to, that would have expected that it would have been able to leverage those resource wealth, oil, to boost development, to boost growth. But this is not happening because even as the country, if you look at the aggregate measures of GDP, it has high GDP. If you look at the average income, you will think it's a high average income country, but there is high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, because those resources are not used to advance the interest of the majority of the people through investment in public infrastructure, through investment in public services. So it's important to then go and document, where do the resources go? Where does the oil that's being exploited, where does it get, how does it get traded? Who gets the revenue? How is the revenue being shared? Who owns these corporations that are benefiting from natural resource exploitations? And these questions, you can't answer them if you just look at the aggregate figures. You have to go into the details of institutional, regulatory, sector analysis. And that's what we're trying to do for Angola.
Now, turning to South Africa, it has an economy that is larger than that of Angola and Côte d'Ivoire or Ivory Coast combined. It lost $198 billion due to capital flight, according to your findings. It seems that the worst period, though, for capital flight was just after the fall of apartheid, but that around 2010, there's another slowdown, there is a slowdown in capital flight. What policies drove these changes in slowing down the capital flight?
Thank you for the question. Again, I'll clarify, but let me say that South Africa is a very, very interesting case in the sense that, unlike the case of Angola, which I just described, which is an economy that's dominated by a few commodities, South Africa is probably one of the most diversified economy, and therefore it makes for a very interesting case. Even though it has a large number of mineral resources, it's also a very diverse economy in terms of manufacturing sector. So it's important to see how capital flight also occurs in a country like South Africa that's more diversified. Also an economy that's, in terms of the modern sector, it's much larger than the other countries. Now, just a nuance, then this is important for people who are listening to us and reading the report. The statistics we produced for South Africa cover from 1970 to 2015. But because of lack of electronic data on trade, on exports and import, that's comparable South African data and partners data for the period from 1970 to 1996 or 97, we were not able to include estimates of trade misinvoicing. So in a sense, the series between 1970 to 2007, they could be underestimated because of not accounting for trade misinvoicing. So it's actually not correct then to say that there is a spike from 1998, because the two series before that we are not including a substantial adjustment, and after that we are including a substantial adjustment.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there. I was speaking to Léonce Ndikumana, professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Thanks again, Léonce, for having joined us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining the Real News Network.